The meaning of life. How do we live? Part 1. How can we live? What do we live for, if we live for anything at all? How to distinguish right from wrong? Is there any reasonable way to answer these questions that doesn't require us to fall back into blind faith? Let's ask the ancient Greeks about this. People have been striving to find answers to these questions for literally thousands of years. One of them was Socrates, 469 to 399 BC. One of his most outstanding achievements was the idea of carefully examining a person's beliefs using a method reminiscent of cross-examination. This idea was called dialectics. It involves asking test questions and getting answers to them in order to come up with some result that can be considered true. In essence, he acted as a devil's advocate and forced people to prove what they claimed to know. For example, there is a story in which Socrates met a young man who was about to go to court and accuse his father of impiety. When Socrates found out about this, he obviously considered the young man a great connoisseur of piety. He pointed out that in order to accuse one's own father of wickedness, one must oneself be an expert in piety. Then Socrates said that he was ignorant in this matter and modestly asked the young man to give him a definition of piety. Man has tried many times without success to determine this, while Socrates each time has offered a simple and irrefutable explanation of why each proposed answer is wrong. It is easy to guess that Socrates eventually got the establishment that existed at that time, and he was sentenced to death. He could have fled, but chose to stay in Athens and take the poison. Socrates highly respected the laws, and was ready to sacrifice his life to stay true to his principles. When I read about his life, I simply could not help but feel great respect for him and his philosophy of life. Another philosopher who made a significant contribution to the question of how one should live was Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC, a student of Plato. Plato himself studied with Socrates. The young Aristotle developed Plato's ideas about the nature of reality, the world of forms, but subsequently Aristotle began to move in a new direction and set about solving the question of how one should live. The best answer he found was the concept of eudaimonia. Unfortunately, this word is difficult to translate into English. Of the translations known to me, I like two more than the others. The first is happiness, and the second is human prosperity. Most of the other translations I have seen are variations on these two. Personally, I would translate this term as performance, although this is also not the most accurate option. Eudaimonia is a process of virtuous living, not some fixed state. It is not an emotion, as happiness suggests. Aristotle arrived at this answer because he found that eudaimonia is the only potential goal of life that can be seen as the ultimate goal, rather than serving as a means to another goal. I think that this term is most often translated as happiness, precisely because happiness is self-sufficient and ends in itself, and does not serve something else. Aristotle was interested in finding the right path in life, assuming that such a thing exists. His answer, which is eudaimonia, has two main parts: virtuous action and contemplation. The main problem was that the way to define virtue was to observe people who led a virtuous life, prospered and paid attention to their way of life. As it turned out, such people behaved with some degree of directness, honor, courage, honesty, rationality, justice, and so on. This is not just an internal observation that can be made within oneself. Such values are visible from the outside, so Aristotle made some progress in trying to create a semi-objective standard of right living. Like Socrates, Aristotle was also sentenced to death, but he chose to leave Athens and live in exile. I am extremely grateful to live in a society where philosophizing does not carry a death penalty. The main problem I find with Aristotle's astute attempt to answer this question is that his solution is somewhat loopy. To live well, we need to live virtuously and spend time in self-knowledge and learning, but how can we know what criteria we should be guided by when choosing virtue or what we should teach? Mostly, we are looking for people who, we think, live well and prosper, and in the time of Aristotle, it was also suggested that we might strive to imitate the gods, since they certainly live well. This is similar to some modern religions that give some model of virtue as a role model. However, Aristotle did not answer one key question: what does the best life one can live look like? Eudaimonia offers a way to start looking for an answer to this question, but there are still many gaping holes in it. After Aristotle, many other people addressed the question of how one should live. Each religion has its own answer. Different people say that there is no answer, that the answer doesn't matter, that we can't know the answer, or that the answer is purely a matter of personal choice. The worst possible answer is what most people do, and they completely ignore the question. Choosing your own environment. What are you living for? Wealth? Power? Service? Longevity? Common sense? Love? Faith? Family? God? Virtue? Happiness? Fulfillment of your purpose? Comfort? Satisfaction? Honesty? Take a look at this list of values. You can choose from hundreds. It is important to make a global choice about how we should live, for that decision sets the environment or context for everything else we do. If you don't choose your environment, then you end up in the default environment or in the average context, that is, in fact, you allow others to set it for themselves. To generalize, in the US it's mostly a commercial, materialistic context. He says you need to find a job, start a family, save some money and retire. Be a good citizen and don't get in trouble. But in any case, don't push yourself. Be a good cog in the car. Other cultures have their own average contexts. Most people simply tap into the average context of their culture with little individual variation. Sticking to the average context of your culture is one of the worst options. Let's look at simple cases of democracy and dictatorship. In a democracy, no one is actually in charge of the cultural context as a whole, so the most common contexts are a patchwork of bits and pieces that lack overall coherence. Overall, this leads to confusion and mediocrity. Such a society has only very vague ideas about how you should live, like getting a job, having a family, avoiding trouble and quietly retiring. Ask Americans what it means to live the best possible life, and you will get many different answers, most of which will be very vague and indistinct. In such answers, Socrates would find many flaws. If you live in a culture with a consciously directed context, then you have to worry about who directs it, what their motives are, and whether you can trust them. In a society with a strong dictatorship, you will usually see a more concentrated environment than in a democracy. If you were to ask someone from Nazi Germany what it means to live the best possible life, I bet the answers you get would be much more uniform and focused. But the problem, of course, is that such contexts are often designed to keep their supporters in power. To fit into such a context, increased pressure is required. In the long run, these types of environments lead to frustration, numbness, or bigotry. Thus, if you allow society to dictate your environment, which happens by default, in the absence of a conscious choice, then you will most likely have it either very fuzzy and vague, or focused in the wrong direction. In any case, the choice is not impressive. Definitely not the best choice. Such a context will not give you enough guidance on how to live right. You will spend a lot of time wandering through life at random or making many mistakes that will haunt you in the future. Ultimately, if you want to get closer to the best possible life for you, you will have to choose your own environment. You cannot simply inherit it from the average context of your society and live as others expect you to. If you are trying to adapt, then you are wasting your life compared to what you could have done with it if you had chosen a better environment. So how the hell are we supposed to figure out how to live? Just guess and hope for the best? Is there any rational, reasonable way to make such a difficult decision? I cannot make this decision for you, but I can explain how I made that decision for myself, which ultimately gave me a very satisfactory answer. I believe that part of my answer applies to me personally, but I also think that part of it is universal for all of us. Live by virtue. Having reached maturity, I began to think seriously about the question of how I should live. The first significant stop on this path occurred for me exactly at the place where Aristotle left it. When I was 20 to 25 years old, I spent a lot of time living a virtuous life. I saw the best possible life for me as a virtuous person, to live with honor, honesty, courage, compassion, etc. I made a list of all the virtuous qualities I wanted to achieve and even invented exercises to help me develop them. Benjamin Franklin did something very similar, as I read in his autobiography, and each week chose a particular virtue to focus on to develop his character. Strangely, at that time there was one extremely favorite computer game for me, Ultima IV. To this day, it remains my favorite game of all time. In this role-playing game, you are the avatar, a seeker of truth, and your goal is not to destroy some enemy, but rather to achieve what is called the Code of Ultimate Wisdom. To achieve this goal, you need to develop your hero in the 8 virtues. All these virtues stem from the 8 possible combinations of truth, love, and courage, as follows. Truth equals honesty, love equals compassion, courage equals courage, truth plus love equals justice, truth plus courage equals honor, love plus courage equals sacrifice, truth plus love plus courage equals spirituality. The absence of truth, love and courage is pride, the opposite of which is submission. I find this virtue system to be absolutely excellent, especially since it's taken from the game. Years later, when I finally met Richard Garriott, developer of the Ultima series, at the Electronics Entertainment Expo, E3, I asked him how he came up with such a system and why he chose those virtues in the end. He said he started by brainstorming a long list, noticing patterns in how the virtues relate to one another. There was a downside to my attempts to live virtuously. I was thrown in different directions from communicating with people who obviously did not live like that. Unfortunately, the gaming industry is replete with such people, especially where big money is involved. I was willing to do business with people who held honor in high regard, but it saddened me that there were so few opportunities to do business with such people. Too many people put money above personal honor and dignity. So I swam against the current. But even under these conditions, I still prefer this choice to all possible alternatives. In trying to live virtuously, I also started running into a lot of internal conflicts. Although I do not blame the virtues themselves for this, but rather my limited capacity to live in full accordance with them. Every day I lived quite virtuously, but what did the big picture look like? What was the idea of running a gaming business to entertain people? Was she virtuous enough? I began to put more pressure on myself to do more and move towards a higher ideal. For 2 years I volunteered for the Shareware Professionals Association, without pay. I have written many free articles. I consulted and trained people for free. I spoke at conferences for free. I pushed myself to sacrifice more for the benefit of others. I missed several opportunities to make more money, instead taking advantage of opportunities to help others. I felt that this behavior improved me, but it was not enough for me. I still felt that I was far from optimal in terms of my ability to live virtuously. At first it seemed to me that such is the nature of life, that it would be a lifelong struggle. But soon I began to feel unsettled, to feel that something was not right. For many years I could not understand what it was, and therefore I remained in place with only what I knew. I ran into the same checkpoint that Aristotle encountered in his time, which prevented him from getting to the answer to the question, what is the best possible life? I knew that it was somehow different from the life that I led, but I did not know where to look for differences. Steve Pavlin's article was translated by Andrew Jezhara. The Meaning of Life, How Do We Live? Part 2.